Okay.
All right, so hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's digital programming. I'm Ben Spagan and I'm the Vice President at the Jefferson and I'm a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. Joining me in conversation is Dr. Parris Baker, the author of the recently released publication, A Pain-Filled Polarized America, Reflections, Recommendations on Racism in the U.S. and in Erie. Dr. Baker is an assistant professor and director of social work, mortuary science, gerontology programs in the Department of the Criminal Justice and Social Work at Gannon University. Dr. Baker is also a faculty member of the Erie Psychological Consortium Predoctoral Psychology Internship Program and the Erie Bible College. An ordained elder, Dr. Baker is pastor of Believers International Worship Center Incorporated and founder and director of Men of Valor Ministries and the Abba Fathers program. His research interests include African-American fathers, incarcerated fathers, non-custodial fathers, community and teenage violence, childhood poverty, and cultural diversity, individual difference, and inclusion. He is married and has 4 children. He is no stranger, too, to the Jefferson Educational Society, having presented in the past and recently co-authored the essay Martin Luther King Jr., A Man for All Time. In his most recent publication, A Pain-Filled Polarized America, Reflections, Recommendations on Racism in the U.S. and in Erie, he opens with the line, America is weeping, as a nation and as a people. Surprisingly, he continues, at a time when the United States has become more isolated from and less allied with our international partners, the world has joined in our nation's lamentation and outrage. Watching the synchronized horror of George Floyd's death from the knee of an apathetic and indifferent death-dealing officer was more than our nation and world could bear. Now, in the wake of Floyd's death, recorded and distributed for not just the nation but the world to see, marches and protests began and continue. Policy change is following. Now, Dr. Baker examines America's history, grappling with racism in the context of George Floyd's violent death in police custody, the rise of global protests, and the ongoing pervasion of the coronavirus pandemic. Now, while reviewing the country's history rooted in racism and the centuries-long impact it's had, Dr. Baker highlights current initiatives such as Campaign Zero and outlines key recommendations for both the nation at large and specific to Erie to drive equitable progress through policy. Now, that report was released Friday, June 19th, and is available on the Jefferson's website at www.jeserie.org. Since this program is first airing live on the Jefferson's Facebook page, we're going to work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you have a question, just leave it in the comments section below, and we're going to do our best to get to that. Now, if you happen to be watching a later broadcast of this event, please do feel free to send us questions, and we'll do our best to get them along to Dr. Baker. And of course, for more information about upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programs and publications, please visit www.jeserie.org and like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Dr. Parris Baker, thank you for joining me for this discussion.
Thank you, Brother Ben. Looking forward to this discussion.
So in the intro, I started with a powerful line. It just took me to my knees when I started reading this because we had talked about you writing this and talked about various ways to approach it. But America is weeping is the line that you begin with, a powerful opening. Also in your intro, you happen to note that Georgetown University sociologist, Dr. Michael Eric Dyson, who happened to visit Erie last November as part of the Jefferson's Global Summit, described this period in America's history as viewing the unabridged, expurgated version of Black pain, grief, resentment, and anger. We're confronting both history and present. In the present, we happen to also be in the middle of a pandemic, and you use that to context set at the beginning. Tell us the role that this has played in the conversation about the virus of racism.
You may make some parallels between the two. And again, thank you for allowing me some time to kind of go through this. From my vantage point, the virus exposed America to the framework of America's development. And so it's not a revelation in that it's something new, as much as we kind of took the covering off of a framework for America. That framework has been in existence for 400 years. And we're going to get into some really, really good conversation about that framework. So I'll try to slow down a little bit. But in the preparation for today's conversation, and I want to take you back, if you allow me, that will help our discussion. I was on a panel discussion, if you remember. It might have been the first time formally I met you. You were the moderator, and it had to do, I think, with responsible journalism about violence or something like that. And I gave you a white piece of paper, and I said, "Hold it." You remember that?
I do.
Yeah. Now, what I want you, because this will help us understand the pain-filled portion of the report in of America. Now, that was 2 years ago, 3 years ago, maybe?
I think so. That was a while back.
It was a while back, but imagine if you were still holding that paper. And again, if you allow me just for a moment to change roles with you, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and then we'll jump into some more discussion. What would life be like for you if in that posture, 90 degrees, you were holding that paper 3 years later? What would you want to talk about?
What would I want to talk about then, or what would I want to talk about now, still having held the paper?
Having held that paper for 3 years in that particular posture for 3 years.
I want to talk about the fact that I'm still holding something where nothing's changed.
Right.
There's nothing written on it. There's nothing new. You know, I'm still holding, stuck in the same position you left me when you asked me to do that.
Right. And imagine the physical pain, the emotional pain, the psychological pain that you would have felt 3 years later, magnified day in and day out, trying to figure out. And so the pain-filled America is not 3 years for you, but 400 years of being placed in a position where you're asked to do things that don't make sense, trying to figure out what tomorrow is going to be like. And here is where the pain is for me, although there is some hope and some kind of victory on the other side of this, is looking at tomorrow, wondering if it really is going to be different than today. And so where does the hope or the emphasis for change come from? To me, it's amazing in that pain-filled 400 years that African Americans found the courage to get up and to move forward, recognizing that at any point in time, a lot of bad things could happen. And there were very few things that they could touch that could change their situation. Again, kind of like you. Someone gave me some instructions, I'm going to do it, but I'm trying to figure out, why am I doing this? How does this make sense? The unabridged version of this is every now and then in America's history, there's been a moment where we said enough is enough. And so if you go back to the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, civil rights, and here we are, and I'm leapfrogging quickly through history. There are some critical moments where people just have had enough. And this is not for anyone to justify, riotous behavior. But there is a point where there's kind of a cathartic release where people are just saying, I can't take anymore, or I don't want to take anymore, even if they could.
Well, I think that's one of the challenging things that we find ourselves in, is we have these moments in these catharses, and yet we're still having these conversations. And I want to get into that later of what makes 2020 feel different, what makes now feel different. But one of those things that I do think makes this feel different, in that you capture so poignantly in the beginning, is the balancing of COVID-19 and the virus of racism at the same time. And you write, it is interesting and ironic that both viruses, racism and COVID-19, are transmitted through human-to-human contact. Moreover, each will require Americans to change personal attitudes and behaviors to prevent further transmission of the viruses. Unpack that for us.
Well, wow. Again, think about what it means to be an American, what it means to be Parris Baker or to be Ben Spigen. When we're born, we are taught everything about who we are and the environment around us. Now, when you think about the education, at least from my vantage point, what I was taught is that, simply put, white is good, black is bad. That white is right, dark is wrong, and so on and so forth. And you see that in the movies, in the black and white era television. You knew the bad guys and the good guys by who had the white hat on and who had the black hat on. Those kind of things. You never saw, again, in my world, an African-American male or female who was the central figure where they were the hero, the heroine. And so you grow up with this kind of identity formation. Beyond that, when we start unpacking history, it amazes me that from the South, my grandparents would tell me survival skills. Like when you are a child, you will learn to not look a white man in the eye. Conversely, if you are white and you are a child, you are taught to be an authoritarian figure over an adult Black male. That's amazing, but that's part of the history of America.
Well, and one of the things that, you point out there is that, in the black and white movies, we see, white is good, black is bad. And still to this day, we see exclusion. It's not that long ago that we had Oscars So White. The fact that there was not representation of talent outside of those who are white. So it's not just something relegated to, black and white pictures or, eras when it's Gone with the Wind, when that's heralded as a groundbreaking film. Now we begin really having honest discussions with that. A great piece recently in the New York Times talked about, coming to terms with what that movie actually is. Yeah. So such an important moment for us culturally. And then thinking about those behavior switches and, maybe it's easier said than done, but I know people resist the idea of having to wear a mask to protect themselves, but also to protect others. But,
yes,
that personal attitude and those behavioral switches and changes to stop that. Just give us a few thoughts on, what people can begin doing or continue doing that you see are some important first steps for personal attitudes, behaviors, ways to begin thinking differently, and really curbing the spread of the virus.
Well, there is the words kind of sound alike. There's reflection and being reflexive. Reflection is thinking about an event after the fact. And I think America is in deep reflection now. Where the change is going to occur is reflective thought and behavior. There is no way that change is going to happen with just reflection by itself. We'll have interesting, cute conversation, but we won't change very much. And it's really safe to be reflective. It takes courage to be reflexive. After I come to terms with what's going on, asking yourself a serious question: what's my role in the change? I've thought about it. Where do I fit? Now, what am I going to do? And again, because you're my brother, and I feel like it's just you and me talking. I know the world is watching. I'm going to have conversation with you as if no one else is watching, or I'm going to give you the secret. It's not a secret. The world, America, knows that we're racist. We won't admit it. We won't come to terms with it. And one of the things I've been asking some of my white brothers and sisters is a very simple question. And that is, if you were bitten by a venomous snake, where does the antidote come from? From the venomous snake. If you have a virus, where does the vaccine come from? Yes, from the virus. If we are a racist society, where's the cure? It's got to come from the folks who establish, who design this product. And let me be clear about that. It is not white people. It is a concept of whiteness. And because if it was white people, then you would be racist. And I don't see you that way, although there's some thinking that all white people are racist. And I get that just from some of the sociological stuff. But you don't behave like a white supremacist, blah, 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 blah. But there is a concept of whiteness. And that's what I was talking about earlier, in that our education system, our Christianity, our democracy, is built on this notion of whiteness will dictate, will develop policy, will make the rules and regulations, design the programs, decide how people will see themselves. And that concept is ingrained in America. Again, if I can just drill down just a little further.
It's just you and me, Parris, so drill down as far as you want.
Okay. Imagine if I took away the notion of being a democratic society. What does that mean? To be democratic from a white perspective is that you are the ruler of chattel slavery. So I take that away from you. That's part of your identity, and I take it away. Now, who are you? When I think about the Pledge of Allegiance, okay, can you recite that real quickly for me? The Pledge of Allegiance to the flag.
Under the United States of America and for the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, for liberty, justice for all.
See, I couldn't say that. One nation under God. We can't celebrate the same God in the same place. Indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. For African Americans, that pledge stops real quickly, right in the middle of it. We can't play that out in a way that's meaningful until we address some of that stuff. So if America comes to terms with the whole notion of racism and whiteness, we got to redefine ourselves. We got to think about, what do these words mean? How do they impact my life? And again, that's the reflection and then being reflexive. And we'll have a lot of work to do when we begin those kind of conversations.
Well, I to follow up on that, because we're talking about, and I think you put that so well of, if you're bitten by a venomous snake, where do you go for the antidote? If you catch a virus, where do you go? And I don't want to give it all away, and because I want to encourage people to go and read the report, because it is so critical right now. But another quote that I do want to give from that is for various reasons, you write, for various reasons, Americans ardently avoid and resist race-related conversations. And so here, I think to your point, we're resistant. We know where the antidote for the poisonous snake comes from, but we refuse to go there. And this is arguably one of the most important and one of the longest unaddressed dialogues in our nation's history, that we can't just come to terms to have that conversation about it, to then be active about it. What's different now? If we couldn't bring ourselves to talk about it fully in the past, in the 80s, in the 60s, and I feel like I can keep going back 400 years to 1619. If we couldn't do it then, what's different right now?
Smartphones. Yes, if you think about, we just celebrated Juneteenth. For Black people, it took 2.5 years to get information from Abraham Lincoln to Galveston, Texas. We can do that in a nanosecond now. And so technology will have a critical role in our change. And so that's one thing. Secondly, there are a lot of folks like Ben that are out in Erie, out in Pennsylvania, out in the world, who are saying, how can I be part of this change? Again, I am just blown away that the entire world is now celebrating an African American, unfortunately his death, but saying the name George Floyd is amazing. I don't remember at a micro level that ever happening. At a national level, Martin Luther King, Barack Obama, the world is paying attention to what's going on in America. But racism has been around so long, and again, the whole world knows it. In different countries, they experience it in their own different ways. But in that moment, the alliances that grew out of that were amazing. And so we have a culture that's kind of primed and ready. One of the things I've said in Erie personally is, again, if I use my spirituality, is God has put a lot of people in the right places for this time. In my lifetime, I'm 62 years old, I have never heard an elected official say, I'm going to, in my tenure, my goal is to eliminate racism in Erie. Now, I have always said that's an impossibility. But our mayor has said, that's what I believe and that's what I'm going to do. It's that kind of positioning, whether people think that's naive or not, to take that position along with other people across the different continuums, whether it's healthcare or education or what have you. We have a lot of people in the right places with the right motivation, all pushing in the same direction. And so the rock is going up, maybe we'll get it over the hill. It'll roll down.
And that's actually something that one of our scholars in residence, Andy Roth, actually just wrote about. And he's been trying to cover different books in his series that make sense to read now. And he's been trying to unpack the American tapestry, the American narrative. And he talks about that in a recent update and talking about why it's challenging for white people to have dialogue about race. And he uses that metaphor with Sisyphus of, we seem to get the boulder so far up the hill and only for it to roll back down, but something feels different. Even he acknowledged that. In your report, I don't want to gloss over two things that I think were important, and I think you do such a wonderful job in highlighting and explaining them and using them as tools to help us understand the differences. As you talk about the two types of grief, and you talk about complicated grief and disenfranchised grief. And so for somebody who maybe skipped over that section or maybe hasn't yet gotten to the report and wants to get there, explain the differences to us a little bit so that we can understand that and begin to use that in our toolkit to continue to have these conversations.
Well, part of America's weeping is that we're grieving. And so complicated grief is having multiple sources of grief, multiple sources of loss. So I may have lost someone because of the COVID virus or because of the riots or protests. Someone may have been hurt, injured, or killed. That along with, I may have lost my job, and I may have lost family members in terms of relationship and access to freedom to come and go. All these things are happening at one time. It complicates how to focus on any particular one source of grief. There's a lot of them. Disenfranchised grief is not having, any one source of grief validated. So when I talk about George Floyd and I'm grieving, and you and I, when we had our initial discussion, I would tear up, and I still kind of do that. Just thinking about what I saw on television. And then to hear people, again, from various sources say, what is that about? Or get over it quickly, or let's move on to something else. It doesn't provide the adequate attention to something that's very real for me. And again, now if we think about complicated grief, each source of grief not being validated over time is a disenfranchisement type of grief.
I can't help but wonder the people, because I've heard it too, of just move on and get over it. And of all the people that I've talked to that have watched the 8 minutes and 46 seconds, have watched the video, I don't hear those questions coming from them, because even just watching the video and thinking about processing that for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, a man is grappling with, he knows his life is going to end, cries out for his mother, his dead mother. It's hard to understand that. I think that people have a reaction that say, get over it, or, he's a criminal, or this isn't a big deal. How are you having those conversations, Dr. Baker, with people that are dismissive like that? Maybe haven't watched the video. Are you directing them to watch it? Are you directing them to think about something? Are you listening? What are you doing? How do we move through that reaction when people have that, and we have a hard time as individuals dealing with that reaction, that it's not in line with ours? How do we process that?
If we take that moment, which was inescapable because of our relationship to technology, you couldn't escape it. So there were times, and again, aging myself, where you only had 3 stations, they cut off at midnight. You didn't want to watch something, you could just cut it off. We go back to 1955, because as we were talking before, this George Floyd's death sent me all the way back to Emmett Till, 1955. And I had the same kind of reaction, more intensely with Brother George, but nonetheless, I felt that. And I want to put back in this idea of technology. I can only imagine if we had that kind of technology in 1955, we would have, I think, would be having the same kinds of conversations, because people did not believe, they wanted to deny that that's not real. That could not happen in America. Are you kidding me? Here's the crazy thing about the Emmett Till thing, and I think I put this in the paper. Because the 2 murderers were not found guilty, they were paid $4,000 for their story. They were not in any way held culpable for that. They actually admitted to it, which is crazy. And so when you look at that, and then you bounce forward, and African Americans are asking the question, what more has to happen? It's on video. Why are we having these enormous conversations about something that you can clearly see and hear yourself? There's something inherently wrong. But for me, how I process that is, let's go to 400 years versus 3 months. What am I talking about? The COVID virus shut down America, closed up America, now going on 4 months. We've had primarily white Americans rushing to Capitol buildings, armed to the gild, demanding their First and Second Amendment rights because they were denied those rights for 4 months. You felt pain and suffering for 4 months and you're up in arms, but you can't empathize with 400 years of oppression and discrimination and waking up in pain and not having any kind of rights on and so forth. I try to put that side by side. Do you understand the inequity of that evaluation? And I try to make it personal at some point. If you allow me 2 seconds, actually about 15, 20 seconds. When I'm doing training, I do a lot of training. I always start off generally with training is going to be uncomfortable. It's designed to be uncomfortable. And what we have to get comfortable with is our sense of uncomfortableness and resist the challenge or resist the impulse to change back to what's comfortable. So I ask people, put my hands here, to put your hands in a prayer posture. For those who are watching, you can actually do this. And then look at your thumbs. My left thumb is on top of my right thumb. And all I ask people to do is just change the position. So take your right thumb, put it on your left thumb. And immediately, what do you feel? It's uncomfortable. It doesn't feel right. It feels weird. It feels awkward. And your impulse is to put it back. And what I tell people is to resist that temptation, because what we're asking America to do is to become uncomfortable, to get comfortable with those uncomfortable conversations, not run away from them, not go back in denial, not pretend like they don't exist, but to stay engaged. And if you stay that way for a while, you'll get more comfortable with it. And that's really the challenge in a simplistic way for where we're going.
I think that's a great example because our reflex is to just go back because it's easy.
Yes.
It's how it has been. It's how it had been. And we know that there's a comfort in that which we already know versus new and different and something strange and foreign to us and sometimes pushing through. I think that's a great example. And I hope people hold that as just an easy way to begin thinking about that and taking that action. One of the sections in your report, you title, "The System is Not Broken." And you begin with, "Let me be clear, America is not broken." Out of context and at first blush, folks might think that that's good news. You're saying it's not. And so unpack that history, because we keep talking about the difference between what it's felt like for 4 months and what it's been like for 400 years. And so the system is not broken. America is not broken. Tell us that.
When America decided to pull away from Great Britain, it began in protest. And it identified what those protests were going to be by writing them down. And in that legislation, you will not find African Americans or Native Americans. Anyone who doesn't fit the mold of those forefathers, they're not written into that Constitution. They're not written into those amendments. That's how it was designed. And so that's why I say it's not broken. Our system was built on inequality. It has been built on slave labor. And if you bounce real quickly through history, you have the Revolutionary War, then you have the Civil War. What's that fight about? Slavery, the economics of slavery. And you bounce forward again. And so you have separate but equal, though we know they're not. And then you have the Board of Brown versus the Board of Education, which ruled constitutionally that was unjust and unconstitutional. And then you bounce forward. And every time that you bounce forward, what you see is a legislative change. And I bounced too quickly because I bounced over the Civil War and then Black codes and Jim Crow. And so every time there was a change, the system struggled to adjust itself where? Back to its origin. And now I look at why I say the system isn't broken. In fact, I say it's working efficiently. Is if you look across a variety of different disciplines, variety of different metrics, you will find African Americans tend to be at the bottom rung. So if we started out unequal, 400 years later, we're still there. So if the system was designed for one particular group to be on top and one particular group to be on the bottom, or several groups to be on the bottom, then it is working efficiently.
And I think that's one of the things that you do so well in the report. And I want to encourage people to, again, go and read that and to really sit with it and think about it. And one of our audience members has read it. And I think it's affirming what you're saying and saying that the system is intentional and it's been designed intentionally, and that we do need to address the system. And this person's asking, and I think this is, what we wonder about is, well, who does the work? Who should do this? Legislatively, administratively, something needs to happen. But as the person is asking, who urges, who makes this happen? That's what a lot of people throw their hands up and might say, well, how does it happen? Who makes it happen? Where does the proverbial buck stop?
Yes. Let me go to one of my mentors, though not physically, though his writing is as if he's present. That's Martin Luther King, or James Cone for that matter. If we think about Christianity, and what does it mean to be a Christian? Immediately, at a variety of different levels, we should kick in. This is what it means to be a Christian at the micro level, at the organizational meso level, and at the macro level. And we get to make decisions all along the way. So in our micro interactions, and again, if you allow me just to throw in some scripture and churchy stuff, there was a story, and most people know it. It's in Luke chapter 10 about who's your neighbor, who's the good neighbor, the good Samaritan. And then you had the priest, and you had the Levite, and then you had the Samaritan. What was the one who addressed the need? The other two, who were trained to do what they were doing, and that's a whole nother this conversation, decided to walk on the other side of the road. But when there was need present, this person got off their horse or donkey or whatever, attended to the person, took him to a place to heal, and said, whatever this person needs, charge it to my account. Because here's one of the things I believe from as one nation under God, is that the greatest change that we can affect is at the micro level, taking care of each other. Because when we do that, we will tend to gravitate to each other. And then organizationally, we'll begin to find people who represent our views, and we vote that person or persons into office. And that's how we do it. But because we're so segregated, and again, if this person will allow me to elongate this conversation, part of what white America did in the 60s and 70s, this problem got a little too heavy. We had white flight. I'm just going to move away from this problem. Well, there's only so much land space in America. And again, with technology, it's hard to move away. I would encourage, in the sphere of influence that you have, try to make it happen right there. Don't try to look for the miraculous or the Herculean kind of effort. I was talking to a friend, white friend, and they asked kind of the same question, what can I do? And I asked a simple question. Same question to you, same question to this person. I don't know if they're white or not, but to any white person that's listening or watching, have you had an African American have dinner with you in your house? There's something about inviting a person who's different into your domain. What I found is, again, not saying white is good or bad, just trying to understand the process, that many times white people come into African American communities to do something and then leave. Where I challenge, come in to build relationship and stay. And what happens in good friendships is I come to Ben's house, Ben comes to my house. We share a meal, we talk, we talk about what's really important to us. And over time, Ben becomes part of my family because he shows up a lot. I come to Ben's house and we become family. How does it happen? Again, my idiom is there's no substitution for time. We don't do that in one visit. It'll take some time where you will learn to trust me and I will learn to trust you in these shared dialogue. So it's, we have to resist the temptation to make this some kind of, do an assessment, planning, implementation, evaluation, and here's an outcome, and let's go move on. That is not what this is. We're asking to change a culture, which is incredibly hard to do. Usually takes 2 or 3 generations to change that. We're asking people to change lifestyles. In some cases, change friends. In some cases, change family members. You may lose family members over this. I am just impressed with the number, and again, just from my purview, of white women who are saying, this is an issue for me. Why are they saying that though? Because I have Black sons. They're with interracial relationships. And now that is becoming so important to them. How do I raise my son or daughter, given the climate of America? So I would encourage at that level, just be intentional in building those relationships, and not for the sake of I have white friends or Black friends. Really is because I really want to know you, the person. And I want you to come into my world. I want to come into your world. And I'm stop there for a moment.
Well, Parris, I was going to say, I think too, an extension of that, maybe even just simply getting started. I wonder if it's reading and learning from people that are different from you. Being able to tap into, if you're a white person, tap into Black scholarship and read Black authors, and to understand a point of view as a gateway to getting there, especially in a time when you're saying technology is so important, and now we have access to many, many writings. And we see for the first time ever, the bestseller lists on the New York Times being dominated by Black authors. That's never happened before, that this moment has moved that forward when we're sitting at home with more time to read, and we're sitting at home with the ability to read more digital books and have more digital conversations. So that may be a way that we can just get started now and certainly get to that, invite people into our space, have dinner, break bread, and be able to build friendships that way. One of the things you mentioned, sorry, go ahead, Parris.
If I could just jump in. I'm trying to learn Spanish. I'm horrible. I'm horrible. And it's because it's a luxury. I don't necessarily need Spanish to survive. Everyone who's trying to teach me Spanish says to me, if you are immersed in a Spanish community where no one spoke English, you would be forced out of necessity to learn this language. And you would do that relatively quickly. It's the immersion process. And I say that because there's a notion of centrality that I've been studying. And there's a couple ways to think about the centralness of a subject. And one is from the observer kind of phenomenological view, where the object is central. I'm focused on the object, but from a peripheral kind of perspective. This is important, but it's still my lens, my paradigm that's guiding how I see this, as opposed to being inside central, looking out. And so this centrality is important. And when you mention reading the narratives of African-American authors, that gives you a different paradigm to understand what is it like to be here looking at the world as opposed to looking into it. And so I encourage that. And not just with African-Americans, the voices of anybody who's different, whether it's gay, Native American, or what have you, we need to look at those voices and listen to those people. And I'm glad we're having this conversation because it's near and dear to me. When we're doing our networking, it is really, really important to listen to what the person is saying. And what I mean is you can hear this kind of like the public discussion, and then there's this underneath. I'm still trying to figure out and trust you. So listen with a different ear, with compassion, because I'm really trying to say something, but it's kind of, I don't know if it's safe enough to tell you the complete truth. So we got to hang in there long enough to hear what a person is really trying to communicate, more of their gut level stuff.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that, when I hear, when I do hear folks saying, I'm at a loss for words, I don't know what to say. One of my quick reactions to that is, if you don't know what to say, maybe you better listen,
Yes.
and to just be able to absorb more and to be able to take it in and process it so that you have that opportunity to deepen your exposure, your context, anything that's happening. One of the things that you mentioned earlier, Dr. Baker, was Emmett Till. And I don't want to gloss over this because I think it's such an important table that you include in the report. You provide a table that reviews the historic examples of public police brutality and lawlessness by white men. You go on to then reframe your opening. Why is America weeping so viscerally in view of the entire world? Answering with, America has an extensive and repugnant relationship with lynching.
Yes.
And this is something that I think is sometimes tough for people, because back to the educational system, there's a lot left out of our history lessons that we learn along the way. And I think one that is in the zeitgeist right now, it happens to be the massacres in Tulsa, because that's just not something that people tended to learn about, what happened in Tulsa 100 years ago. But we also happen not to focus on our relationship with lynching, to the fact that the United States Postal Service used to send postcards featuring that.
Mm-hmm.
So teach us our history, please.
Well, it's been in the news recently this weekend with the presidential rally that he had in Tulsa during the Juneteenth weekend. And what was lost, and if you allow me to bring in a current event that happened in Erie, where we had an officer say, Black people pulling the race car. They should learn to take care of themselves, that kind of thing. And I said, with all due respect, officer, blah, 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 you don't know your history. Because everywhere in America where Black people have become self-sustaining, including Greenwood, Oklahoma, that has been taken away. I looked at the pictures and I read the historical narratives of an entire city being burned to the ground. And what got me was, and people got in airplanes and bombed the city. Incredible. And no one was arrested, which blows me away, that there was no judicial repercussions of that behavior. But here's what's crazy. When I look at that, you find that all over America. There was Rosewood in Florida. I forget what the city was originally, but it's Central Park. It was a community of African Americans that the city obtained the land through eminent domain and made it Central Park. It actually moved an entire city out of the way, 250 or 350 people, just forced to leave. And why do we do that? Part of it is, it's the nature of being an American. We just kind of take what we want. And so, following the idioms of another mentor, Cornel West, that's why you have chocolate cities, you have vanilla suburbs, and you have strawberry reservations, because we force people into these different locations. And then we ask these incredible questions. Why is it like this? Well, there's no education or limited education and employment and so on and so forth, and all the rules that go with that. And somehow you expect great things to happen in these environments that are absolutely oppressive and repulsive. What amazes me, again, Ben, is that, you're hearing my grandmother speak, is that in the midst of all of that, we've learned to do more with less. It's amazing. When you think about, for example, the 1920s, give or take, 1910 to 1930, what was going on in America, and particularly what was going on in America for African Americans. You look at the Harlem Renaissance, for example. All the art and all the literature and all the music that came out of that's like changed the world. But what did it come out of? Pain and suffering. Most of it's connected to pain and suffering. Now imagine all the voices that were silenced, that we didn't hear, that didn't make it because of all these different rules. How much art and literature, music did we lose because we had all these rules that said, you can't be this or do that in this environment at this particular time. And that's the kind of stuff that makes me sad, because we'll just never know. The cemeteries are filled, they're resource rich with the voices that were silenced.
I think that's again, back to technology, an important part of today, and what might make 2020 different is that we have the ability to communicate in mass with each other, and to have cameras running constantly, capturing images and following protests and seeing what's happening. And I think that that's, you know, a path forward, because we can continue to have those conversations and not lose sight of it, you know, as we so tragically did in our past. One of the things, because I want to get to, and again, I don't want to give it all away because I want people to go and read this report. I think it's such a critical read for this moment and to help the country and help Erie specifically move forward. But one of the things you do mention before you get to the recommendations, we had begun this discussion around this, looking for, you know, what's happening nationwide and things that, you know, we could take a look into that might make sense as we start to do more than just talk about it, but look at policy and what can we do to undo some of what's happened with policy. And Campaign Zero landed on our radar. So what is it? Why does it matter? And what should we be doing with it locally as we grapple with these conversations here in Erie? As you mentioned, we had a police officer send an email filled with racist language who has since been fired. You know, we have a continuing debate over an officer perceptively using force or not using force to address a protester. Some might say forcefully pushed with foot, others might say kick, you know, and we have footage of that. And so we're trying to figure these things out and move forward. So Campaign Zero was something that came onto our radar as we were having conversations leading up to you writing this incredible report. What is it? Why does it matter? And what should we be doing with it?
I'm going to let people, you can actually go to their website and read some snippets of what it's about. But simply put, it's just a bunch of concerned people like you and I that are saying at a macro level, what can America do? And how do we change the narrative moving forward? And so, I mean, there's some, to me, these are kind of simple recommendations, like we need policy that hold police accountable. Since the time you and I have scanned those, we're seeing that all over the nations where people states are redesigning their policies related to police or affirmative action or what have you. Things are changing. I mean, stuff is happening so fast, it's hard to keep up with all the things that are changing. But at a national level, and I think it comes out of Barack Obama's 21st century reform policies. And I hope that people kind of keep that in mind, because there's a lot of criticism about what has Barack Obama done in America for Black folks and so on and so forth. I take that really personal. Yes. So I don't want to talk about that one. It's like, oh, yeah. Anyway, there are a lot of things for me, to keep it simple, what's important about Campaign Zero is that of those 8 bullet points, they're kind of broad-based, which allows a lot of flexibility, kind of like the global local thing, is think globally but work locally. That whatever we're doing here should connect at the macro level. And so if you allow me just to like drag those down, is, you know, every, at least in Pennsylvania, every state office has a local office. So whatever we're doing locally, whether it's with county council or the city of Erie, that somehow it is directly connected to what's going on in the state of Pennsylvania, so that we are in concert to, or we are informing the state, so that it's not just happening in Erie, Pennsylvania, but throughout the Commonwealth, that we're making systemic change. Because one of the things that people argue is, how is this systemic? And who's responsible for it? Because I'm a real big person. Find out who the names are connected to who's legislating these policies. There are so many names, we can't even get into that. But I do say this, if we're talking about education, it's easy to identify at the local level who's our superintendent and who's the director of the Department of Education in Harrisburg, and just follow those dots. Does this make sense? And so stuff is happening right now. I like the Campaign Zero because of the goal, kind of like our mayor, we're going to have zero racism. I just like the fact that we're moving in that direction, that we're closer to moving to those points. If you allow me, I think we're going to get to the more specific recommendations for Erie. You know, I've lived in Erie all my life, and in the 16503 zip code for most of my life, except for maybe 4 years. So 58 of the 62 years on the planet in one zip code. And some people might have issue with that. How do you know the world living in the same zip code? I don't know. But you know, it's 2 years ago or 3 years ago, we were touted as the worst community for African Americans to live in the nation. Now, again, there's all kind of methodological problems, but I know that when I was born, I went back and looked at the data. 1958, 1960 census reported our poverty level was 40%. Today, the most recent statistics that I found is 46% in that zip code. And so all the negative things that are associated with low education and unemployment, all the ancillary things that are connected to that are all found in this community. And so when we look at, for example, I'm going to fold this, that racism is a public health problem as much as it is anything else, because sometimes we fold it into police problem. I think violence is a public health problem also. What we're finding is right now, if you look at the COVID-19 data, where are the most cases being identified? It is not surprising that it's 16503. And so one of the things I would like to promote, or that I did promote in the essay, is that while we're making these legislative changes at the state level or at the national level, we should earnestly work at it. And again, to the person who asked the question, what can I do? Try to make Erie, I remember, I think it was in the 60s, 70s, I think it was in the Tulsa administration, an all-American city. Yes, that this should be a city in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania where if you're African-American, it happens for you right here. And again, I don't think there's a better time. At the same time, I am so enthusiastic and so hopeful. I'm fearful that we will miss this opportunity. And I don't know what it will take for us to get back to where we're at right now. But right now, we should be taking advantage of all the opportunities and all the people and all the systems that have positioned themselves that we can move forward. And so put African Americans back on the map as this is the best city in the nation for African Americans to live. And by the way, if we say that, we would get past the adjective of African American. It would just be the best city for people to live in.
Well, I appreciate that. That's your first recommendation out of the gate that you make for this report is develop an action plan to identify Erie as one of the best cities in America for African Americans to live. And then, that's something great to aspire to. And you're saying action plan, we need that. And then take it one step further that it's, the best city, period. With the listicle that came out in 2017, sure, we can debate the methodology and say, well, there's faulty numbers here and faulty numbers there. But if you're picking apart whether you're number 1 or you're number 7, yes, or you're still number 20 of the entire country, there's still a problem. And that certainly revealed it to us at that point. I think an important part of this, one of our audience members has put a finger on, is economic injustice. And so what do you see as you're coming up with the recommendations, as you're thinking about this, as you're calling us to task? This person's wondering, how do we work to that economic justice for our Black community, for our communities of color? How do we work toward that?
Great question. I'm going to throw in at least one or two other things and I'll wrap up, put it all together. There's an environmental injustice that goes along with the economic justice because we tend to treat the worst neighborhoods poorly. We don't have this thing called social triaging where you have the worst part of the city getting the most attention or the best attention. In fact, again, I mentioned in the report, comprehensive plan says to ignore that part of the city and to again, doesn't use the word gentrify, but I do. It says to, knock the houses down and make it green. And my question is, there's not a mention of the people who live there. Where do they go and what do they do? And so if you recommend that, there should be at least some statement of humanity to those people. Now, I say that connected to this point specific to the question, and that is education. A few years ago, I venture to say 4 years ago, the Erie School District was ranked 485th out of 500 school districts in Pennsylvania. That's very low. And then when you look at our data, and again, it's a little data, about 5, 6, 7 years, I'm not sure. You know, 1/3 to 1/2 of African Americans, Latino students, particularly male, are not going to graduate from high school. And that we become a community, like most communities, where technology is going to be the way to find family-sustaining wages. And so focusing specifically on our education system and changing the way it's funded, because again, in the 16503 zip code, you know, 86% of the people who live there rent. And we know that we get our finances from property taxes. And so we might want to think about how to reimagine paying for education, and all the things, particularly technology, that are needed to help those students rise to the top. So I would say specifically, without getting too inundated with other things, education would be the #1 focal point.
And there are models out there nationwide that we can look at. It's not as if Erie has to invent the wheel for the first time. You know, one of the things that I saw happen in Detroit as Detroit was coming out of its first crisis in the bottom falling out was the idea that if you graduated high school and lived within the city limits of Detroit and you had attended a public school there for 2 years, community college education was paid for. And so that's a pathway to education. So there are examples out there. You point to some things that are working, you know, here already that we need to continue to focus on more. Tell us why it's important to be able to highlight the things that we are doing and doing well that we need to do a little bit more. And then I want to just touch on at least 1 or 2 things that you're recommending that we do for the first time.
Okay. Well, I want to talk very quickly about at least the community college, because that's been approved. I'm not sure how that's going to unfold, but there was some groundbreaking research done in the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, that very clearly said the pathway out of poverty, the single variable that contributes most, is education. You cannot ignore that data. It takes about 4.2 years to do that, post-secondary education. And so what do we have to do? We have to, and here's what's important about the discussion of not having a revised history. We need all the painful lessons of our history need to be told to all of our students, because inside of that, it's amazing what African Americans and other people of color have contributed to America that is not in traditional history books. And whether that's science or technology, or take your pick, African Americans and other people of color. And by the way, every time I say that, Ben, I take a deep breath, because if you think about it, we may have had this conversation. There is a microaggression to saying the word or the phrase people of color. Because if you ask any person on the planet, who are members of people of color, they will never say white folks. So we are reinforcing every time we say people of color that there are white people and everyone else. And I understand why we say it, it's in our vernacular, but I'm trying to get it out of my vernacular, because it just reinforces that there's one group and then there's everyone else. And I said all that and forgot where I was going.
So we were talking about education, but I think that's an excellent point that I think a lot of people struggle with, is what are the right words? You know, what are the right words? Is it people of color? Is it Black? Is it African American? And, you know, I can't help but think your call to action of a great city for everyone, you know, and that, you know, being able to, you know, remove some of those labels, because I think that maybe this is, you know, these are my English degrees showing, you know, anytime we put a label on something, we begin to then pack that with meaning in terms of when we use a word, you know, the word itself is powerless until we give power to it. And we can give power in great ways, and we can give power in absolutely terrible ways. And so, you know, words can become weaponized, but they can also be freeing and empowering. And I think that's such a hard part of this conversation is finding the words and being able to be open and honest when we say, well, we cringe a little bit when we say this, but it happens to work right now in our vernacular, but we're trying to move beyond it. I think that's something really important.
Yeah. And here's the interesting thing. You and I having this conversation, if you said something that you might have found, that you may have thought was offensive, you would ask me and I would say, Ben, and I'd forgive you and we'd move on. Why does it happen? Out of relationship. When it's someone you don't trust, you're not sure, why did you say that or why did you say it that way? Recognizing that 90% of communication is all the gestures and intonation, all that kind of stuff that happens with the word. But if I don't trust you, I'm very suspicious. But if I do trust you, then your heart is talking to me. And I know Ben is not saying or doing anything to try to injure me. So even if you do say the wrong word, if there's such a thing at that point, the wrong word, it's not injurious because relationship can sustain that. And so we can move through our conversation relatively quickly. And if we get stuck, we can talk through it, as opposed to when you don't know people, you don't trust people, you're not familiar with them. That becomes the sticking point. A case in point is Black Lives Matter, all lives matter. I can't believe we got stuck on the phrase. Well, that was just a way of deflecting and denying really important conversations because we just don't know each other. So it was a comfortable way out of the conversation. Okay.
I think that's such a...
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say that's such an important part of the report that you mentioned, that those three words and how we get hung up on that, and it becomes, not what the origin of Black Lives Matter meant and still means, but that if you say that, do you mean all lives don't matter? And that now we turn it to, looking at the police relationship into this conversation and saying, well, blue lives matter. And with people then, saying, well, I think all lives matter, so I'm saying that. And to me, BLM is offensive because we're prioritizing that. But I think you treat that so well in the report.
I remember where I was going, so connecting now. There are a lot of good things that are happening in Erie. And part of me staying in Erie is because I wanted to be part of what's going on right now. When I finished my work, my doctoral work at Pitt, African American with a PhD, you can kind of pick your spots. And I chose to stay here. I had offers to do postdoc work at the University of Michigan and UCLA and so on and so forth. But I said, why help people I don't know? It was a conscious choice, intentional, to stay in Erie. For better or worse, kind of like a wedding, marriage. I made that decision. And the payoff is what's going on right now. You have a mayor with all the stuff that's going on in the police department. I've done 28 ride-alongs. We have a clergy ride-along program that we're putting together to get close enough to officers, not only to see what they're doing, because with a little suspicion, why are you here? Are you trying to watch me and catch me? It's really to build relationship so that you can trust me. So not only can I share with you what's going on, but to hear from you, what do you need? And I always, with pride, tell folks, I officiated the weddings of 2 or 3 police officers. And been in business and helping with other officers. That would have never happened without those relationships. So the mayor's office has Strengthening Police and Community Partnership, a program with personnel dedicated to focusing on one part of a larger problem. And so you have, in our government, I think, enough of the right people in county government and city government, healthcare, education. You take your pick. I see these incredible people focused on doing one thing, and that is trying to mitigate the effects of racism. The silent march that happened, I have to mention this. It was amazing. There were 3 white pastors, Bishop Persico, Bishop Rowe, and Pastor Sanford, who, in my opinion, some people argued against it, but it makes really good sense to me, and it follows scriptural dogma. They repented. Why are we repenting? I didn't do it. We didn't do it. It's because it's an acknowledgement that it was present in our society. It still remains there. And I am standing, whether I did it or not, I am standing on the privilege of being white based on whiteness as a concept. And I'm committing to changing that. I was blown away. And that's what I mean, having the right people in the right places. Just amazing people committed to what's going on in Erie. So it's a good time to work. I can't remember, I didn't know there were 10 of them, so I'm not sure of all.
10 great recommendations. You can find all in the report. I encourage people to take a look at those. But I'm so glad you brought that word up, and privilege, and the idea of repenting for it, because I think that that's another tough part of conversation that we have is, well, I didn't do this.
Right.
History did. Or I don't have privilege. I don't see myself as having privilege. I struggled coming up. But it's that acknowledgement that just inherently by the system, which you say is not broken, but built efficiently, there are advantages that certain people have that other people do not.
Yeah, and again, in different trainings and just conversation with people who struggle with that, I ask the question all the time. If you go to the emergency room, and most of us at one point in our life have gone to an emergency room, you go in, you give your financial information, they do their vitals, and then the next thing they're going to do is ask you for your medical history. They want to know honestly the history that got you here so that their intervention or their prescription is connected to the right thing. So what they need you to do in giving that history is tell the truth, because my medical intervention right here has everything to do with how honest you are about the stuff that happened that I don't know. I say the same thing to America. We need to be honest in our history so that we're not proscriptive but prescriptive. Actually, we need to do both, but and how we're going to move forward. And if we don't have an honest discussion first about that history to unpack all those painful things, we will try to move forward with the family secret, you know. And I use that because in every family, I don't care if you're white, black, rich, poor, everybody has an uncle or a grandma or somebody you go, and you try to ignore them because we all know who they are and what they do. And we're just trying to see past it. When really, in my family, my grandfather had Alzheimer's, and we all knew it, but in my family, we didn't know anything about dementia. Most of us were afraid of it. This was in 1980 something. And we just didn't know. So I'm doing a little research, blah, 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 blah. Had we intervened, honestly, getting past our fears, we would have treated him differently. We would have treated him better. Not that we were treating him poorly, by the way, but it would have helped the process, and it would have helped our comfort level to do that. Again, I say the same thing about America. We really do have to do those things. So
I think it's the honest sharing of knowledge and the information, and being able to realize it's not done. It's never done. Continue learning, continue developing an appreciation that is deeper and deeper and deeper as we move on. Dr. Baker, we are almost out of time. In fact, we're a little bit over time. We've gone long, but this has been such an important conversation that, you know, before we started this, I said, we're not against the clock. You know, I want to have this conversation, but you know, as we're about to wrap up, there's so many different takeaways that I think I could point to. And I pulled out some of the quotes that I think are so important from the piece, and can't recommend enough that folks go and read it. And think about the report, digest it, reflect on it, and be reflexive, you know, about it, and you know, use it as discussion at the dinner table, you know, engage somebody about it. But if you were to give us one big takeaway, and I know that's a tall order, you know, to say final question, of all the things that you include and all the things you tell us, what do you think, you know, one, maybe two, you know, from your report, A Pain-Filled Polarized America, Reflections and Recommendations on Racism in the U.S. and Erie, what should that be?
It's not well articulated in the essay because of the nature of the essay, but I want to focus on pain-filled. When people are in pain, one of the obvious things that they want is for the pain to stop. The longer the pain continues, there's a correlation between the continuance or the increase of pain and the lack of hope that accompanies it. The longer it goes on, the more hopeless people become. And so part of what I would encourage people, there's a phrase, I'm going to be an agent of change. I get that, but I would submit that we need to be agents of hope, and not just bringing hope, but actually being the hope. that my presence here is not just to encourage you, not just to empower you, but to walk alongside of you. And that's not white people coming into Black communities or Black people going into white communities. What I'm suggesting in terms of humanity, that we are on this human earth planet together. And just like Dr. King said, if we don't learn to love and live together, we will die together as fools. It is just that critical. And that's one of the things that the virus has revealed, or excuse me, has exposed in America. Virus doesn't care who you are. I will attack you and kill you if you don't make the necessary changes in your lifestyle. I will come in your community and destroy it. Well, racism is kind of the same way. And so we need each other in a way that I think heretofore we have not seen. Just real quickly, again, to make this point, the Brookings Foundation reported incredible things, Ben, like the amount of anti-Semitism is as high as it was during the time of Auschwitz. That's amazing that the hate crimes against Muslims is greater than it was during 9/11. Right now, we need each other, and we need to have a sense of hope. But again, I encourage people not to just be hopeful, but be hope-filled, so that when you come, you actually say, I'm going to walk with you, I'm going to walk through this with you. That is the definition of compassion, is shared suffering. And so we're going to identify what the suffering is, what the challenges are, and I vow to stay here with you to get us through this together.
Dr. Baker, I can't thank you enough for the report. I told you I felt the best I've felt in a while after reading it, and I hope other people do.
By that, by the way.
I hope other people do too. And I'm so honored that you're pledging to be here with us, because this is not the period in the end of the sentence of a conversation. Really, this is the comma to keep us moving forward. We need to have conversations. We need to explore this. Certainly, we can't get to everything in this program. We couldn't get to everything in the report, but this is a conversation that we must continue having. And we're so grateful to have you here in Erie having it. So, Dr. Parris Baker, author of A Pain-Filled Polarized America, Reflections, Recommendations on Racism in the U.S. in Erie, and a man of so many more and other accomplishments. Thank you for taking the time to join us for this Jefferson program here.
Thank you, sir. It has been a pleasure, my brother. And I mean that sincerely.
Thank you. And to all of you watching along at home, thank you for tuning in. We are grateful for you taking the time to spend with us today to unpack this. Again, to go and read this report, head over to the Jefferson's website at www.jeserie.org. There you'll find that report and information about other upcoming programs, past events, videos we've had, as well as a whole range of other publications, including the co-authored essay by Dr. Parris Baker on Martin Luther King. And of course, be sure to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Spagan. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for learning with us.